Welcome everybody to the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development 2021. This is the opening plenary, the era of people and planet, ecofeminism and intersectional environmentalism. Before we begin, we will have a couple of virtual housekeeping announcements. This is Rachel Ong, the technical support for Global South Women's Forum 2021. This session provides interpretation. Please go to interpretation to choose your language channel. Mute original audio to only hear the interpreter. As participants, please switch off your videos and mute your microphones. If you are experiencing slow bandwidth, please close any unnecessary programs and/or applications on your device. Feel free to use the public chat box to engage with each other throughout the session. Please take note that this session is being live streamed on our Facebook page and the recording will be available publicly afterwards. Do note that we take very seriously any harassment of any kind during GSWF 2021. This includes, but is not limited to, deliberate intimidation, sustained disruption of discussion. We request that participants are obliged to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in disruptive behavior may be removed without prior notice. And with that, Marisa, over to you.
Okay, good evening all. We're happy to have all of you here this evening. So for this evening's opening plenary, focus on the people and the planet, ecofeminism and intersectional environmentalism. We have panelists from the Global South, inclusive of Beatrice Tulagan from the Philippines, Angelique Nixon from Trinidad and Tobago, and Bhanumathi, Dhaatri, I hope I said it correctly, from India at this time. We are also expecting another panelist. Her name is Ruth, Nyambura, probably said that wrong also, from Kenya. Yeah, so since we only have an hour for this session, we're gonna just jump right in. I don't know if the panelists want to give brief introductions of themselves or if I should just move forward with bios, but I'm happy to share a bit. So how we will do this is I'll do bios and then we will just answer a few questions, have a conversation around ecofeminism and intersectional environmentalism, what it means to our work, our movement, and yeah, how we see it as the best fit for advocacy in the Global South as it works in terms of justice, environmental justice. So I'll start with Angelique, if that is okay with you. So Dr. Angelique B. Nixon is a Bahamas-born and raised Trinidadian-based writer and artist, scholar and activist. She's a lecturer and researcher at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. Her research and creative work are widely available. She's the author of the poetry and art chapbook titled Saltwater Healing, and the award-winning scholarly book titled Resisting Paradise, Tourism, Diaspora, and Sexuality in the Caribbean Culture. Angelique is also the director of the feminist LGBTI civil society organization CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice in Trinidad and Tobago. For 2 decades, she has worked for social and environmental justice movements and civil society and community organizations regionally and internationally. Angelique is fiercely committed to intersectional queer feminist praxis, decolonial politics, and Black liberation. Her current research investigates Caribbean freedom, social movements, and and decolonial poetics at the crossroads of migration and climate crises, and also unsustainable development. Angelique, that is Angelique. Okay, so what I will do is go through all of the panelists and then reshare the questions. Is that fine? I think it is. So Beatrice Tulagan. Beatrice Tulagan is a writer and a climate justice organizer, exploring intersections of personal and the political as we collectively confront the climate crisis, cultural shifts, and social politics. She connects movements towards regenerative intersectional activism and exploring what it means to genuinely stand in solidarity with each other's fights amidst societal and environmental shocks. Beatrice is currently the regional organizer of the 350.org in Asia, a climate organization working to build a future that's just, prosperous, equitable, and safe from the effects of the climate crises. Within and outside of her work with 350.org, she organizes alongside Asia's civil society organizations, helps run climate campaigns, and designs training and programs for climate and social justice. She led the Asia Solidarity Lab just about 2 weeks ago, which IWRAW Asia Pacific was also a part of, a virtual gathering of movements in Asia to unite calls towards movement building for just recovery from the COVID pandemic. Beatrice's essays on COVID-19, gender, environmental justice, culture, and mental health have also appeared on Open Global Rights, Manila Standard, Asia Sentinel, and more. She has also contributed poetry and fiction to various publications. She holds a certificate in public narrative leadership, storytelling, and action from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, Executive Education. She's also a former fellow from FREEDA, the Young Feminist Fund and Climate Tracker, and she's currently a fellow with Parabucas and the Climate Advisor to Behavioral. And that's Bea. Bhanumathi Kalluri is the director of Dhaatri Trust, an NGO based in India that works on the intersections of environmental justice and women's rights. Her work mainly involves facilitating collaborative work around women's human rights defenders, particularly Indigenous women, to uphold their rights to their land, forests, and knowledge practices. Dhaatri works with the vision of strengthening voices of women affected by development projects in India, like forestry, plantations, extractives, national parks, climate change mitigation programs, and infrastructure-related displacement and gendered violations. Dhaatri also coordinates a regional level platform called Women in Action on Mining in Asia, or WAMA, on women's human rights defenders, challenging corporate violations, and state accountability mechanism vis-a-vis the mining sector. So welcome to our 3 panelists, or plenary speakers today. So what I really wanted to ask firstly is, how do you prioritize people and the planet in your advocacy? What does that look like for you within your different regions, with the different groups that you work with, and also realizing too that this is somewhat an intergenerational conversation, whereas we are of different ages, we are probably of different ages of feminism also, because feminism continues to change. So what do you, or how, I should say, do you prioritize people and planet in your advocacy within your different contexts? And Angelique, you can go first.
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me well. Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for that question. Well, it's very early where I am, but I know that it's evening, so good evening and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you so much to the organizers of the forum and also to the host organization. I know that it is a lot of work to put on conferences and conversations and gatherings, especially online is still a lot of work. And so I just want to share from my work. I think that in my advocacy and activism, I also include my writing and my teaching and my work as a scholar. And the planet has to be central. And so for me, it's in everything that I do in my creative work. I center the environment and messages about our relationship to the earth and to each other. I think it's a fundamental part of my work as a writer and an activist. In any of the work we do, for me in the Caribbean, and I think, you know, globally in the global South, we center the environment and nature and the planet in ways that are very fundamental to how we live and our relationships. And so maybe we, you know, you'll find that in some of the organizing work and even some of the organizations, maybe we don't use the language of environmentalism. I do think that that language is, you know, sometimes it can be a bit alienating, but for me and the work that I do, I think it's just literally in everything. We are living in crisis. We are on the front lines, those of us, especially on small islands and in countries and regions that are being devastated by climate crisis. It is everywhere. So it has to be a part of everything we do as an activist. And so I think it really depends on what we're talking about. So for me in my teaching, I make sure that I include issues, and I consistently make sure that when we talk about the world, when we critique issues related to development, as I teach in an Institute of Gender and Development, we're consistently talking about the harms of unsustainable development, the issues of global capitalism, the investments in the tourism industry, extractive industries, and foreign investments that devastate the environment, that have devastating consequences on culture, on people, and on the planet and the environment. And so I make those connections. And, you know, when I was invited to do this and think about this idea of intersectional environmentalism, and of course, intersectional feminism is literally at the core of what I do. In my research, as Marisa said, you know, in my new book that I'm actually calling Submerged Freedom, I am taking the time to think about those interconnections, and I think that's what I bring. We have to think about them together. We have to think about the complicated movements for sexual and gender justice and social movements to address the most pressing issues of our time, and we need to think about them alongside so many challenges that we face. And so I'm also thinking about that through my research. I'm thinking about the issues of migration, the issues of unsustainable development in this moment of climate crisis, and how that intersects with various social movements for sexual, racial, class, and gender justice, because they are so connected. And then finally, for me in my creative work and in my work as, you know, just raising consciousness and awareness, I think it's our duty, as if we have a voice, to use it and draw those connections. And I recently did a TED Talk TEDx Talks for Port of Spain, and my talk was called The Elements of Decolonial Healing Justice. And that's another example of where I wanted to bring all of these elements to make those connections and call on us to think about healing at the root. And for me, that is about prioritizing our healing as, you know, as formerly colonized people, as people of color, as women, as marginalized people, as sexual and gender diverse people, and what we've experienced, and also living on the front lines of climate crisis. And so those are some of the ways that I've done it, and I think it is consistent. We have to consistently show up in all the work that we do, and we have to raise the alarm because we're in it. We're in it, and it is, you know, it's devastating. But somehow I'm still hopeful, because I believe in the power of our voices and the work that we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Angelique. I really like that approach to the way in which you see it beneficial to us, very necessary. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Beatrice, can I pass it to you?
Sure. Hi, Marisa. Hi, Angelique. Thank you for inviting me. First of all, I really admire the work of IWRAW and you, Marisa. So I'm super delighted for the opportunity to learn from fellow feminists working in this space, and I'm super excited. Magandang gabi. Good evening from Manila. I think you mentioned something earlier about intergenerational activism and its value, and that made me think about my beginnings in advocacy work and how so much of it, if not all of it, can be attributed directly to the work of so many activists that have been fighting for years before me on all fronts, and not just on environmental justice or gender justice, but on all fronts. I grew up watching the news a lot because my mother is a journalist. And I've always been curious about activism and resistance because it made the headlines frequently when I was young. Although, of course, said headlines were not always necessarily strictly about environmental or gender issues, very curious. I got very curious about organizing dissent and social change because of them. Because after all, to honor my roots, I grew up in the Philippines where our people have overthrown two violently corrupt presidents in recent history and have achieved independence from not one, but at least three colonialist powers through people power as well. So that being said, advocacy and activism to me have always been rooted in lived realities of people. And advocating for a planet has always been to me advocating also for the rights of marginalized groups. To be frank, advocacy and activism don't really make sense to me unless they have the interlocking goal of liberating us, vulnerable people, from interlocking systems of oppression. When I got into the climate justice space, it was the same framing. That the task at hand is to ensure we break free from powers that seek to commodify both nature and actual human lives for profit of the elite. So then in my work, it shows up, especially in my writing and organizing and speaking engagements. I try to do my part, like Angelique, in connecting the dots, making these very important connections, speaking often about how the roots and impacts of the climate crisis, for example, exacerbate what a lot of people think as separate issues, right? Such as human rights, health, gender violence, and more. Ultimately, I think climate change is a collective people's issue. And I try to highlight that the best way to go about it is through collectivizing care, collectivizing organizing, collectivizing resistance. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Bea. Vanu, can I pass to you?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to hear all the other speakers sharing a similar, essence and core of what I also wanted to share. We work with indigenous women and rural women across Asia who are very deeply affected by the kind of development policies that our states are pushing very violently, very brutally, whether it is extractives or conservation or infrastructure and economic projects. So in our work, what we see is that there is no disconnect between people and planet, especially the indigenous women see it as a contiguous flow and an interconnected engagement with nature. It is not exclusive or individualistic, but a more holistic and sustainable approach to living your way of life by harnessing nature in a as harmless a manner as possible. So what we are finding is that the definition of people and planet as defined by states and investment agencies today is the P and P are being replaced by one big bold C, which is corporates, as if the planet is only corporates and people don't matter. And as if people can be replaced, as if biodiversity and nature can be artificially compensated or regenerated after plundering the earth with extracting minerals or building hydel projects or building big resorts in forest areas. So we, as a network in Asia and as an organization in India, are trying to redefine what people and planet, what people and nature mean from a women's rights perspective, specifically from an indigenous women's perspective, because this perspective carries with it the fundamental essence of engaging with nature from a gender equal and a women's rights perspective. So this is the essence of our advocacy in terms of protecting nature and protecting people on this earth.
Thank you so much, Banu. That was very well expressed also. And thank you, Bea and Angelique, for your previous takes on the ways that you use people and planet in your advocacy. So I was going to ask a question around defining ecofeminism in your context. However, you have done quite a good job when you speak to your advocacy. But what I would possibly ask now is, how are there challenges that you also foresee in the way that you take on ecofeminism, or you try to be intersectional in the way that you look at environmental or climate justice? Like, what have been the challenges? And I know this wasn't, like a question, etc., but it came from the things that you said. What have been some of the challenges that you have experienced in terms of whether it's locally, if it's an issue in terms of disinformation, lack of knowledge? Have there been any challenges? And you can answer freely. Angelique, do you want to tackle it first, or Bea, or yeah?
Sure. Hi. There we go. Not seeing me. There we go. Hi. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of challenges, and I've written about this as well. I think for me, I've been reflecting on this for a while. I have, I did a lot of research on the impacts of tourism, extractive industries, the investment, the kind of building that happens, and the over dependence on tourism and the tourism industry, and what it does to the environment, what it does to people, what it does to communities. And it is so clear in the context of global capitalism, in the context of neo-colonialism, that we're very much living, and we continue to live in moments where profits are put over human need and the environment. And so there are many, many challenges, because I think, even though that we are living in the climate crisis, I think for small islands, especially who have various relationships with former colonial powers, with global north countries that determine a lot of trade, economic relationships, and really determine some of these larger stake issues that smaller countries are really feeling those the great impact and devastating consequences of these decisions that are made. And we are then, we're left with that. So I think some of the challenges are that, one, we have such a small carbon footprint, and I know this is for, other small island countries as well, and nations, that even, the kinds of policies we can make locally are not going to make the impact. And I think that's when we see the movement 1.5 to stay alive, that's been driven by small islands in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, right? Because we recognize that it is a global issue that we need to confront. And I think we heard that as well when CARICOM countries made a plea at the United Nations in the climate conversations that were happening from 2019 into last year. So with the pandemic, we are even in greater economic constraints. And so I think a lot of the challenges are, we have the double bind of trying to deal with economic crisis, trying to figure out how do we fix the immediate problems, issues related to public health, issues related to the economy, and then also try to manage these devastating consequences of the climate crisis. Of course, they're all connected, but I think one of the challenges is, how are countries able to address those connections? And so I see a few challenges. One, also the language of ecofeminism, although I love the ecofeminism, I think it's the way that it's been mobilized is so amazing. But and even environmentalism, I think sometimes those things, and perhaps it is, across our region, that in the Caribbean, that even the language of environmentalism and environmental movements have been really led by middle and upper class, and sometimes organizations that don't make those intersections. And I think that's a challenge. We need environmental movements, we need organizations that are working around issues related to the environment and to climate crisis and working towards climate justice to be intersectional. And then I think we need human rights organizations to also be inclusive of, the attention to climate justice. And I think we're seeing it more and more. I think in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the Institute for Gender and Development Studies has long done these intersectional work, research, action research projects, and leading outreach and activism on these issues. I think a lot of organizations, Cropper Foundation, for example, the organization that I work with as well, CAISO, we attempt and ensure that we're being as inclusive of intersectional issues as possible. And so I think that's a model. But I do think that the huge challenge is that it feels really overwhelming. It feels like what are the differences that we can make as small island nations and countries in the global south that are so bound by the structures of global capitalism, issues related to structural adjustment policies. And I mean, we can look around the world to see the issues related to conflict and crisis and wars and the economic impact and fallout of that. And we know that exacerbating inequalities already happen through globalization, through climate crisis, and those of us who are the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and folks who are experiencing the interlocking systems of oppression are going to be the ones on the front lines. So I think those are the challenges. It feels incredibly overwhelming and daunting. And I think that is where we're at, being able to figure out how do we draw those connections, make it more and more public, and working, across different sectors. I think those are the greatest challenges as well. And how do we make sense of the crisis that we're in and not feel completely without hope, not feel completely like, well, what is it that we can do? So I think highlighting the kinds of small actions and changes, that's one of the things that I've been really thinking about. How do we start with small actions, And I will share one example and pass on to my co-panelists. I did work in Haiti after the earthquake with a group of healers and artists and farmers, and we did. It was a local diaspora model of cooperation, of solidarity, working in Comier. And we did that. We did delegations every year and worked with local communities, did fundraising to support the work that local communities wanted to do and leaders wanted to do. And we did stuff around the environment, sustainability, supporting farmers and teachers and artists, and doing work on women's empowerment. And it was definitely a lot. But one of the things that I learned is in the small ways, I think, when we can think about, sometimes we have, the problems are so enormous. And what I learned in that work is that sometimes we have to think about those small moments. How can we make the changes in small communities, individually, with groups, and how do we share that and think about how we plant those seeds to literally grow and create the kinds of transformations we want. And so that has been my that's been my focus. How do we create those small waves of change?
Thank you, Bea. Is it okay for everyone? Thank you, Angelique, so much for explaining that, and especially coming from the Caribbean, being a small island developing state, those sentiments are very much the same for me and understood. But I wanted to ask you, Bea, around your challenges as a youth activist, especially. I think that everyone thinks they're doing amazing jobs, but we also do have challenges as young activists. So can you share a little bit on that?
Thank you, Marisa. Speaking as a youth organizer, as a youth activist, and someone primarily working with youth activists also around Asia, I think Angelique has already spoken so eloquently about the very real material challenges that we face, the structural challenges that we face. But what I'd like to speak about is the very insidious and diabolical ways that, for example, the fossil fuel industry has made it super hard, if not virtually impossible, to come up with visions for the future that are not grounded on the existing ways of operation that are, that continue to prop up multiple sites of oppression. And it's this radically hard time to imagine where a new future, new ways of seeing, hoping, building, that I think that I face as the biggest challenge, because in campaigning work and organizing work, it's always easy to campaign against something or organize against something. But sometimes it's difficult to, come together and collectively call for a vision for the future that is inclusive, that is intergenerational, that represents all historically marginalized and oppressed people. So I think, if anything, ecofeminism and feminism itself, whatever shape, way, or form you understand it or perceive it to be, is ultimately a futures project, as it offers us that way out of that challenge. If anything, I believe that the many feminisms and the many ecofeminisms in Asia, in the Philippines, has always been about future building. It's always been intersectional, and it's always been aimed at liberating our people, and resisted not only Western neoliberal definitions of the term, which is, a challenge in itself, because how do you make it make sense to people who don't necessarily identify with your version of the term, right? But we're also actively resisting the very North-centric tendency of needing to label our ecofeminist project as that, or ourselves even as ecofeminists. For example, I work with and learn from young women environmental defenders here in Asia. And I work directly with community organizers comprised of women and girls. And they might not necessarily brand themselves ecofeminist activists, but that doesn't mean their work, their legacy, and their hearts are not set on a radically different and radically feminist future. So I think the greatest challenges are also the very things that make us human. It's the difficulty to imagine something else entirely, because we are so deeply entrenched, and not of our own doing, but the doing of histories and generations of oppressive powers, that keeps us from realizing this potential. And I think, the many feminisms that we hold, the many ecofeminisms that will make us and remake us again and again, they are also the ones that can solve these challenges for us and guide us through the many ways of being an ecofeminist.
Wow, I really like that, Beatrice. Thank you so much for that explanation. And actually, yes, I really agree, that a lot of our fight is always against and not towards, a lot of times, like a newer vision. However, with this GSWF, we are aiming for global self-feminist vision towards environmental justice. So we're hoping for change, not just against capitalism or colonialism, etc., but a better future for it. Banu? You're muted, sorry.
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
In our work, the way we see ecofeminism, eco as both economics of development and ecology of development from a feminist perspective. Both these terms of economy and ecology from the women's lens would actually provide very pragmatic solutions for the current crisis that globally we are all facing. Yet the challenge we see is that states are actually fast-tracking economies using the excuse of COVID, for example, as livelihoods restoration and economic restoration, whereas it is very starkly evident from the women's experiences that these are actually leading to further crisis and going to dismantle any kind of, any semblance of peace and harmony on this earth. So this is the biggest challenge we find, that states are trying to invisibilize the impacts of this kind of development agenda on women's lives, on women's food security, social security. And the state and the structural violence is so closely linked to domestic violence. And this violence has only got exacerbated after, since the pandemic has erupted, and it is visible even more. But the kind of solutions, either to the climate crisis that states and investment agencies are offering, or the false solutions to climate change mitigation that are being offered, are really, insulting women by not allowing for the democratic space of articulation and participation, because our constitutions are getting very weak. They are deliberately made dysfunctional by the corporate powers, by the abuse of corporate power. And even the limited spaces women had to participate are disappearing very fast. And this is very dangerous when democracies are getting so dysfunctional. So women's right to participate in decisions related to their land, forests, water bodies is very important. It's as if nature is not women's business, but it's very much women's core and fundamental, primary link to the way they live. So we are finding that even the kind of solutions, for example, if the Asian Development Bank has come up with a new energy policy saying we are withdrawing from fossil fuels, it looks fantastic. But if you read between the lines, they're not really addressing it from a women's decentralized, micro local community, point of view. It's as if, hey, we still have to fast track our economies. We still need to spend a lot of energy. We just will kind of twist, instead of using fossil fuels, maybe we'll use solar energy, or some cooking stoves for women. You distribute some cooking stoves, or welfare programs, and we've addressed women's problems and we've saved women's lives. So this is something very humiliating. And in our network, in the different campaigns, women are saying no to this kind of a non-legally binding, and non-accountable ways of doing welfare programs. And women's rights have to come when we say free, prior, and informed consent. It is being so diluted that women only have the right to say, okay, we take compensation, so we'll either accept sheep or goats or something else. But women's right to say, I don't want this project in the first place. I don't want my forest to be destroyed in the first place. That right is being snatched away because of the land grabs and the forest grabs that are happening, and it has increasing after COVID. So yeah, this is a challenge, but I would also say that this also gives us an opportunity to come together, network much more, and work in a more intersectional way. Because earlier, when I was living in the communities and we've been fighting for natural resource rights, the women's movement was not really addressing these issues from the grassroots, linked to the core issues of land. So violence against women was looking more at sexuality and issues of domestic violence, and not so much on structural violence and the link to resource rights and violence against women. So now, increasingly, as environmental concerns are becoming visible, there is also this understanding that we have to come together both as environment justice groups and as women's groups to redefine development economics from a women's rights lens or a gender equality lens. And I think that gives us a path in finding solutions in a much more meaningful way. So yeah, I just wanted to look at both intersectionality, since you had asked for it, and also the whole ecofeminism perspective.
Thank you. I was actually going to share after, but I'm very happy for you to share that too, Banu. I think is very useful I think also what happens a lot is that we come from different regions and we think that our issues are very specific to our regions, but as we realize within the global south, we're also known as the global south for a specific region, whether they see us as underdeveloped, partially developing, that we have some of the same issues, especially as it pertains to women's human rights, etc. So I'm very happy to hear you share that bit. And I do agree with what you said in terms of, women's movement. We have specific focus, but a lot of the focus that I think maybe now is getting more traction now with COVID also, in terms of being more intentional in how we talk about environmental and climate justice. So my final question with our, 19 minutes, I was going to ask, and Banu touched a little bit on it in her last response. I was going to ask, why should intersectionality be considered or integrated into advocacy approaches towards environmental and climate justice? And that is a huge part of what we have been doing in our work. Like, why? Who should be included? Who are the voices that need to be heard? So I want to ask this question of you, and I probably should say it again. Why should intersectionality be considered, integrated, into the way that advocacy is done towards environmental and climate justice?
Am I up first?
Oh. No, I was going to say, Banu, if you wanted to finish, since you shared your bit, you wanted to add to that and then let the others share, that is fine, because I think you started to touch on it. So it would be nice for you to just finish off what you were already saying.
Yeah, one of the primary, the core of the women's movement, women's voices that are coming out from the campaigns that we are working with is coexistence. Women believe in coexistence with nature and not as separate from nature, and the engagement with nature being sustainable to the local economy, local ecosystems. So, but states behave as if women are, dumb and have no economic sense, or do not have the skills or capability to devise or visualize development policies. But what we see is that the sanity is coming from women's voices. So the environmental concerns and the development policy agenda, instead of trickling from above, if they get decentralized and come from local communities, then there would be a convergence of a more sustainable future that we can look for the crisis that we are facing. For this, as I said, the environmental movement is now looking at a diverse issue of revenue transparency, or for investments, financial flows, or food security issues. So a lot of time the women's voices are missing, because and this is really sad, because women are in the forefront of struggles. They're risking their lives. They are the ones who are actually standing and facing the military or the police when their lands are being taken away. Whereas their demands vis-a-vis their land or forests are not even in the campaign agenda. Most campaigns assume that the general agenda of a male-dominated campaign, again, I'm sorry to say, would also be what the women are demanding. But if we go deeper, the violence against women is of a different nature and much deeper. And the women's demands in terms of the way they want to redefine the policy is also different. So the need for building women's leadership and promoting the women's leadership to evolve and develop within our environmental justice movements is very important, I think. And that is where, as a network, we are putting our energy. And if there is enough conscious effort made where women have the right to access information, women have the right to decide about whatever project is coming into their lands, women have the right to go for legal access to justice and grievances. These are spaces which are really not accessible to women. So therefore, the stronger the convergence and the stronger the environmental justice movement perceives the issues around planet and climate from a feminist lens, we would be able to build more of women's leadership within the movement.
Thank you, Bhanu. Very well said. I don't want to comment too much and then take it too much time. So Beatrice or Angelique, do you want to go, and then we could just wrap it?
Hi, sure. Hi. Thank you so much for that. It's so amazing to hear from these powerful activists who are, doing this amazing work all over the world, and hearing, the similarities that we experience as activists and organizers in the Global South. So I just wanted to share a couple of things around, of course, intersectionality has to be integrated into our advocacy and approaches towards environmental justice. And I think the language of climate justice has been one that a lot of movements are mobilizing because it has, such resonance for this current moment. And so I do think, like we've been saying today, that, we have to reclaim language and, decolonize how we talk about these issues and highlight the ancestral and indigenous ways of knowing and relationships to each other and the earth. And I do think that a decolonial politics has to be centered. And I want to say that, when we think about an intersectional approach in our advocacy, when we think about how we think about social and environmental justice together, I think we cannot separate them. We have to do that work. And that I think using the language of social and environmental justice, social and ecological justice, always bringing them together, is we have to model it. We do it all the time already. And so now I think we also need to name it and highlight it in our work so that it's very clear. And I think we have to do more in terms of educating the public and, engaging in public discourse to talk about climate change, to talk about climate crisis and the social and environmental justice movements as one connected struggle. One of the things that happens, I think this, in the global north especially, there's so much blame on individual consumers around, the crisis that we're in. And we don't place enough blame and accountability on private sector, industries, and governments. And I think we are doing that as well. Sometimes in the Global South, we use some of that environmental language of, as an individual consumer, you should do X, Y, and Z. And I'm not saying we shouldn't also do that. But that's, again, an intersectional approach. When we look at environmental justice and, climate justice, we're showing how these things are connected. And that, I think, shifts how we hold governments, private sector, and industries, multinational corporations that do the most amount of damage and produce the most amount of pollution. We need to hold them to account. And I think that is very much what we need across the Global South, but certainly speaking from the Caribbean and this region, and Trinidad and Tobago in particular, how do we ensure that we make those connections between social inequalities and the climate crisis? Sometimes it's easier to blame our social problems on other things, right? We want to always blame issues of migration. We want to blame, LGBT people. We want to blame everything else except sometimes on, the lack of public policy, accountability, and so on. And I want to say too that, you know, and I've heard this again, especially coming from the Bahamas, we don't have a plan B, right? Tourism development and the tourism industry, you know, becomes the place where we are overly invested. And so we continue to build a tourism industry that does not care about sustainability or our future, right? It's this recipe of sun, sand, and sea and festivals. And I feel as if we really fear calling out the ways that tourism dependency, you know, is literally connected to our, and fuels the climate crisis and is adversely affecting us in so many ways. And so, you know, I want to highlight that because, you know, we're still reeling from the disasters of structural adjustment policies that have left our countries, so many of our countries, in too much debt and our people in poverty. And you know, the feminization of poverty is something that I think also is, you know, that we experience across the global South. And so, and I want to just close in saying that, you know, with the COVID-19 pandemic, I reflected a lot on that moment when everything shut down. So tourism shut down, airlines shut down, and I thought, and wrote about this and reflected that, oh, wow, we have this opportunity. I mean, obviously the pandemic has been devastating, but I just thought at the beginning that maybe this would be our opportunity to radically change structures and develop an economic recovery plan that would be grounded in sustainability, gender and class analysis, food sovereignty, local investment, and regional mutual aid. And those are the things that, you know, so many folks, you know, we talked about at the beginning. And, you know, because it was like, well, we don't have any other choices. How could we look regionally and create mutual aid, regional connections? Think about how in this moment, how can we come together? And that has not happened. We've witnessed the opposite as so many countries just, you know, again, the double bind of tourism, but that is not what happened. And so, you know, we witnessed literally in this past year and a half how vital our public healthcare systems, and I think governments had to make really hard choices to say we have to make sure that the public healthcare system doesn't fail. We have to think about food sovereignty. We have to think about that social welfare programs helped support people during these moments of crisis. It is clear that capitalism will not save us. The market cannot fix this. And so I want to, you know, stress that again and again, that we have to think about the ways that we are still in these moments of crisis, these human-made disasters, where too many people who are marginalized, especially Black and Brown and Indigenous people, when we think about the exacerbation of people who are, you know, who are elders, people who are young, people who are LGBTQI, people who are experiencing different kinds of crises, that we, you know, that these things are just continue to be exacerbated. So I continue to and think about and call for new strategies of resistance through decolonial visions, you know, thinking about regional mutual aid, global South mutual aid, South-South interdependence. How do we feed and heal and support ourselves? How can we decrease vulnerability? How do we work through sharing our resources and rejecting some of the global North neoliberal agendas? And how do we establish some shared leadership and participatory governance that, of course, is feminist, that is grounded in a particular kind of decolonial politics and prioritizes the planet and people and spaces? And that's what I think about when I think about intersectional feminism, intersectional ecofeminism.
Thank you so much, Angelique. That was really great. Beatrice, do you want to close us out?
Thank you, Marisa. And thank you too. I learned so much from my co-panelists. I really hope to collaborate and continue this conversation in some form or another in the future. I think my answer to this can be traced back to what Audre Lorde wrote. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. I think throughout the past hour that we have been talking about this, we've all more or less pointed to the differences, but also to the similarities, the nefarious ways that these oppressive structures continue to oppress the most vulnerable, the most marginalized in more ways than one. It's a well-used metaphor, but as it says, we are in the same storm, but we are in different boats. Some people do not have boats, some people have yachts, some people are barely swimming. So I think it's very important to acknowledge these differences in our oppressive structures, but also it's very important to acknowledge the sites of oppression that intersect with one another, because that's the only way we can respond to them appropriately. I think in our collective project of building a better world, it starts with recognizing that we're not all in a position, for example, to be part of this panel or to be part of this room, this Zoom room, but we should always take guidance from those who are most affected, those who are most impacted by said injustices. Women, children, women with disabilities, LGBTQI people, indigenous groups, and so on. We should look to them for guidance because they have been doing the practices to liberate themselves for generations and generations. And I think I'd like to close with maybe a challenge to everyone. Marisa, you and I already had talked about like how in climate justice work, we often campaign against climate injustices without necessarily always propping up or doing the connective work to form what the vision for climate justice and justice on all fronts. I think we are not, as a colleague of mine always refers to, we're not outnumbered, we're out-organized. And I think intersectionality, this moment really calls for us to link up now more than ever. And we have the responsibility to see these connections through, because to borrow from Lila Watson, our liberation is ultimately bound up with one another. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you for closing it, Beatrice. I think you did a great job. I don't think there's much to say to that, but what I always strongly emphasize on is that within the pandemic and everything, the issues that the pandemic has further exacerbated, there is a bigger need for us in the Global South to come together, build allyship in working towards environmental and climate justice. We can't do it on our own. Some persons or some groups and communities' experiences are worse than some. However, we can't do it alone. There's no need to, create new ideas or create new strategies and, everyone branch out on different stuff. There's a bigger need to come together in a more intersectional, eco-feminist way. And I know most persons wouldn't see it that way. And then, there's the stress of the global north and how they see these attacks on them or see them as attacks on them. But I'm very happy for the words and the knowledge that you shared. And I hope that it inspires many of us and others to just think about the way that we take on the environmental justice fight day to day. So thank you so much. Really happy to have you. And we'll close now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Marisa. Thank you to the tech team. Thank you, my fellow panelists. I learned so much from you both. Thank you.
Maraming salamat. Thank you, everyone.